Grace. Good morning. One more time, can we just give a big round of applause for these? I'm an especially proud dad this morning because one of those seniors over there is mine. So very excited for this big moment. Hey, before we dive in today, I want to just bring a couple of things to your attention. Upcoming this week, Wednesday night is Man Night. And today is the last day to sign up for that. So I think we have a slide on the screen. You can scan that QR code and register. Again, today is the last day to register. If you've never attended one, men, it's such a great time to meet other people, have a lot of fun, and just get connected. So I really encourage you to check that out. Also, here at Grace, we really value just opening the scriptures together. So if you need a Bible, if you would just slip up your hand, and we have some people that would love to bring you one here on the Bible cart. Also, once a month, we share together communion, and today is that day for us. So if you did not receive the communion elements when you came in the door today, also slip up your hand. And as the carts come around, I feel like I'm missing something here. Am I? Okay. As the cart come around, if you need the communion elements, they'll bring those to you. Okay. Well, as you get your Bibles, you can make your way to the book of Psalms. Psalm 78 is where we're going to be for a couple of weeks. We have started a new series called Househeld. What does it mean to be a household that is held by the grace of God? Psalm 78 is a historical psalm. It's a lengthy psalm, but it is a poetic retelling of the history of Israel. And the main point of this psalm is that an older generation is preserving the stories to be passed down to a future generation so that they may know the words, works, and wonders of God. It is the story of two houses, the story of Ephraim, who the scriptures say fell away because they did not remember the goodness of God, and therefore they ultimately forsook the guidance of God. And it is the story of the house of David, who did remember the good works of God, and therefore his household was held in the grace of God. And so I want to bring up on the screen here, before we get to our main text, just a little bit earlier in the psalm that we discussed last week, beginning in verse 2. It says, "I will teach you hidden lessons from our past, stories we have heard and known, stories our ancestors handed down to us. We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord. We will not hide these truths from our children, but we will tell about his power and his mighty wonders." So we see that this older generation wants to tell stories of truth so that the younger generation can learn to trust in the goodness of God and ultimately to walk in the guidance of God. Because stories shape how we see, right? Stories shape how we see the world and ultimately shape how we show up in the world. Because stories shape what we believe, and how we believe shapes how we behave. And it shapes even our own sense of belonging, our own identity in God. And our earliest stories, of course, we've all heard in our families. Last week, John, as he was setting up this series that we're going to do, he talked about the differences and the diversity in families. Of course, here in America, in what we would call a Western worldview, there is an individualistic paradigm, meaning that for us, a deep core question is, who am I in my family, right? But in more Eastern cultures, there is a collectivist worldview. The core question there is, who are we as a family? And how do I represent my family well? And there are both beautiful values in both worldviews, but they are different and they are diverse. And of course, we have blended families. We have single parent families. We have children who are raised by grandparents or just by other people who have opened their homes up in adoption. So many diverse stories, but one thing is for sure, our families have stories, and those stories shape how we see the world and how we show up in the world. I was, for better or for worse, you have been shaped by those stories. If you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me share some stories of my own family. Someone said to me, I hope you're going to tell the story of your crazy uncle. And I said, which one? Meaning, I have a few crazy uncles, and I have a whole lot of stories. But my grandmother got married young. My grandmother got married at 17 years old, and they had 5 children. And my grandfather was a bit of a wild man. He got into an altercation with one of his best friends, nonetheless, and was actually shot and killed, murdered in the street. And my grandmother, young, left to raise 5 children by herself. And our story is one of a lot of trauma, and yet a lot of hope and a lot of love. One of my uncles, her son, got into her worst nightmare repeating itself, got into an altercation, was shot at close range with a .44 Magnum. If you don't know what that is, it's a very, very powerful handgun. He made it to the emergency room, surprisingly alive, and the doctors said he's got hours to live, and so bring in the family that can get here. And much to their surprise, when he made it through the night, they said he has 48 hours to live at best. If you have any family in driving distance, you should call them and let them come, because he won't make it 48 hours. And to everyone's surprise, and he pulled through that, and it was nothing short than a miracle. And I remember being shaped by these stories as a kid, not just of the miracle that he lived, but the beautiful story of how our family pulled together, how they loved one another, served him through trauma, through tragedy, holding out the candle of hope. I have another uncle who our family jokes that he's got 9 lives. By the time in his early 20s, he's an adventure-seeking guy. He had an accident hang gliding, broke both of his arms. He rode motorcycles, so street bikes, dirt bikes, speeding, that was his thing. Our family had a commercial plumbing business, so he would dig these deep, deep holes and trenches to run piping over to commercial real estate, and one time the hole fell in on him. He was buried alive for several minutes, and they were able to miraculously pull him out. But when they did, his heart had an irregular beating pattern after that. And he also had bouts of panic and anxiety, as one could imagine after being trapped alive. But as one does who has panic and anxiety, he had this proclivity for flying open-air, single-seat aircraft. If you don't know what that means, there's a thing called an ultralight, and I kid you not, it is basically a go-kart with wings. And he, as a trade, he also welded steel buildings, so of course he felt like he could weld his own. And he did. He literally took a go-kart, welded wings and a propeller to it, and he flew this thing all over Greenville, South Carolina. And one time he told me that he wanted to see how high he could get in his flying go-kart. And he said that he reached 10,000 feet in his single-seat aircraft. And just to put that in perspective for you, that is when the pilot comes on and says, "You are free to move about the cabin because we have reached cruising altitude." Could you imagine flying the friendly skies and looking over and seeing my uncle flying in his go-kart beside you? He ran out of gas getting to 10,000 feet and had to glide back down. He said he saw the curvature of the earth from that altitude in his go-kart. One day he was flying, and he flew longer and later than he anticipated, and he came in from a different angle from the field, and the sun was in his eyes. And he flew his little aircraft into electrical lines and was electrocuted. I know. And miraculously, he lived through it. I don't know if you, because he has 9 lives. And I didn't know this, but apparently when you get electrocuted with that much electricity, it has to leave your body. So it literally like blew a hole. And I just remember very intently, it was a core memory for me. I was like 10 years old. We were having family dinner at my grandmother's house. And he came in and he said, "Look at this, Cameron. Got a hole in my finger." He's a good old Southern boy. But here's the amazing thing about this. After that, he noticed his heart didn't beat irregular anymore. He went to the doctor and he asked the doctor about it, and the doctor said, "Yeah, I think when you got electrocuted, it shocked your heart back into rhythm." And these are the stories that, to my knowledge, are actually real in my family. But we're not just shaped by stories from our family, we're also shaped by stories of our friends, right? By our community, by our culture. I had the opportunity just last week to be shaped by a really beautiful story in an unlikely situation. As you know, prom. Brookwood prom was last week, and Parkview prom was last night. Am I right? And so we went out to, so there was a group of our kids' friends that went to prom together, and of course, a big part of that is going and getting pictures taken. And then afterwards, some of the parents went out to eat. And though these parents are all acquaintances, but many of them I never sat down and shared a meal with. We were there because our friends were friends with their kids. But we sat down, and the women sat on one side, and the men sat on another side, and, we were just talking. And, of course, the men were, doing the usual banter of like, "My goodness, how many pictures can you possibly take? I mean, how many pictures is enough pictures, right? Right? Wow, a lot of the moms were over there. You know what? Let's take one more picture. Let's take it in front of this tree and in front of these flowers, right?" But I am so grateful that the moms organize all that and implement all that, because if it were up to the dads, we would have no memory of our kids dressed up in the prom. We were sitting on our end of the table, and we were laughing about how we thought it was funny that the men, 5, 6 men, were having one conversation. We were all just having one conversation together, and we laughed looking down the table at the women. They were having like 6 conversations, and they were all involved in all 6 of them. They were talking this way and that way and the other way. And the guy sitting next to me, he was telling his son is a big, big guy, going to be a football player in college, and he was laughing about how we were, as middle-aged men do when you get together for dinner, we were talking about our sleep patterns. I'm like, wow, this is what it's come to. You middle-aged, you sit around and you talk about how you're not getting good sleep, right? And he was laughing, and he said, my son, the funny thing about him is no matter what time he goes to bed, he's an early riser. He said, in fact, on Saturday morning, he said he had gotten up and was out the door by 7 a.m. to go to a yard sale. And I thought, that's pretty funny. This big football player guy getting himself up 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning to go to a yard sale. And he was like, yeah, he went to this yard sale in Brightwater. Now, his wife, who was down the table a little bit, involved in 6 different conversations, she didn't miss a beat. She leaned over and she said, it wasn't Brightwater, it was Flowers Crossing. And he looked at all the guys and he's like, gentlemen, did you see that? And we're like, oh, we all saw that. She's keeping you in line, right? And so we had fun, and we were sharing a meal together. But at the end, one of the parents, the mom, said, I wonder if we could tell some stories. I wonder if before we leave, if we'd all go around the table and share a story of something you just love and admire and cherish about your child, and a story about something that you're going to really, really miss about them. And all of a sudden, the whole atmosphere changed. And as moms and dads went and began to reflect on their love and on how everything in their life has led to this moment, making sure your child is ready to launch well, go out into the next season of life. So it's one full of great hope and joy, and also one of sadness and longing and grief. And when people begin to share that, not just the details, but the depth of their love for their child, it's moving and it's impactful. And can I relate to, and that's the power of stories. It's not just about details. The truths in stories transcend the details with a different kind of depth. Can I relate to the detail of a man who has a son who gets up on 7 o'clock on the Saturday morning to go to a yard sale? No, I cannot. My son does not like to get up at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Understandably so. Can I relate to the depth of a dad who says, you know what, if I were writing our family story, I would have never written that detail into it. And I wouldn't change it for the world. And I will miss it with everything in me. Can I relate to that kind of truth, that kind of depth? Absolutely, because stories hold deep truths and they shape the way we see and they shape how we show up in the world, which is why Jesus told so many stories. He taught in parables. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who had 2 sons, a farmer who went out to sow seeds, a woman who lost a coin, a man who owned 100 sheep, a landowner who hired workers in his vineyard, a treasure hidden in a field, a net let down into the lake, like the tiniest of seed that grows up into a tree. So many stories. Over 30 different parables, Jesus told stories because they hold deep, deep truths. You look at the story of Luke 15, the very familiar one. The story of a father and 2 sons, often called the prodigal son. Those are 2 sons who lived and were shaped by 2 different stories because the younger son thought his actions kept him outside of God's grace and favor. And the older one thought his actions kept him inside of God's grace and favor. One thought he didn't deserve it, and one thought he had earned it, and both of them were wrong. And the story tells a story about the younger brothers and yet of a graceful father who says, you know what, your lack of goodness doesn't keep you out of my grace, and your good behavior doesn't keep you in it. It's not about that. It's about God's goodness and grace. So these stories hold such powerful truths, and you can read them from different angles and receive different things. But one story you and I have all been shaped by is a story of fear. And no one comes out of a family or community without some story of fear or anxiety being told. And what are we going to do with that? How are we going to transcend that? But let's look at this specifically through the scriptures. If you'll look with me in verse 9, it'll also be on the screen. Reading from the New Living Translation, so it might be different from what you have. But verse 9 says, the men of Ephraim, though armed with bows, they turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wonders he had shown them. He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors. In the land of Egypt, in the region of Zon, he divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall. He guided them with the cloud by day and with light from the fire all night. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. And I want to draw our attention back to verse 9. What a haunting scripture. Though they were armed with bow and arrow, they turned back on the day of battle. Though they had the skill and though they had the supplies they needed, something in them caused them to turn back, to avoid, to not stand up what was in front of them. So what was this battle? Some scholars say that maybe this was the battle of Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was taken from the people of God. Of course, this was their most holy artifact. It represented the very presence of God, and they fought the Philistines, and the Philistines took the Ark, and it was considered a judgment upon Israel. But most scholars say that it's probably not really about a specific battle, but it's more about a story of systemic beliefs and behaviors on the house of Ephraim. That is probably more of a metaphor, because Isaiah 28, 1-3 says that Ephraim was condemned for their pride and their arrogance and their spiritual corruption. And Hosea 5, 3-14 describes the house of Ephraim as unfaithful and stubborn, and that God expresses grief over their actions. But the point of the psalm here, again, as this older generation is telling this family story to younger generations, the point is that they did not remember the goodness of God, and by doing so, they forsook the guidance of God, and they were led astray. But when we look back over the story of of Israel and their deliverance from Egypt, we see two stories. One story here in the psalm is a story of deliverance and a story of resilience. They told the story that the people of God were under great oppression and they cried out and God heard their cry and they sent Moses, the great deliverer, to deliver them from Pharaoh's hand, led them through a journey, a wilderness that was challenging. But in that challenging journey, they learned dependence on God and resilience in their heart, mind, soul, and strength. This journey shaped who they were and made them better. But then we see there was another story being told, not one of deliverance and resilience, but one of scarcity, one of lack, and one of abandonment. You may remember in the book of Exodus recounts the story. And the children of Israel, once God did all the miracles, Pharaoh let them go. They went out into the wilderness. And shortly thereafter, it says that some of the people began to grumble and complain. And they said, Moses, did you bring us out here in the wilderness to die? We have no food, we have no water, we have no shelter. It would be better for us to go back to our oppressors. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? And then, of course, Moses prayed and God provided water. And then they complained about the water. They said the water was bitter. They didn't like the taste of the water. And they were hungry. And then God provided manna that appeared for them every morning for them to gather their daily bread. And they began to complain about that. And they said, we don't want bread, we want meat. And I'm like, my goodness, it sounds like a 3-year-old toddler who missed their nap, right? And a little bit, when I read about that, I get a little judgy. I'm like, why don't you be grateful? You feel a little entitled, right? And then I don't have to look far into my own life to realize I'm a little bit like that too. You know? It only takes me to get one not so good night of sleep, which happens to be more frequent than I like these days in middle age. One not so good night of sleep leaves me being over-caffeinated in the morning, which leads me to being slightly dehydrated. If I have a real busy day, I might miss breakfast or lunch. By the afternoon, you know, I'm tired, I'm dehydrated, I'm hangry, and I'm not the best version of myself. Can get a little grumbly, get a little complaining, like the children of Israel. But of course, the point there is that we don't stay stuck in that story. But here's the thing. When we have a family voice, when there is a voice that magnifies what is missing over magnifying where there is provision, we will tell ourselves a story of scarcity, lack, and abandonment. And of course, that story shapes how we see and how we show up in the world. And what the point of the psalm here is it doesn't just do that for one generation, it can actually do that for multiple generations. That the story can shape how they believe and how they ultimately behave and belong in the world. In my training as a counselor, I had to read many, many, many case studies of multi-generational belief structures and how that impacts. And so I want to read you 2 of them just to put this in our modern day context so we can see how we are shaped by the stories we hear and the stories we believe. Helen was a grandmother who lived in the Great Depression. She lived in a household marked by unpredictability. Her father was emotionally volatile. Now, I want to just pause right there and say, you know, most things make sense in their context. Think about that for a moment, that not too many generations ago, we had people who were making their way in the world in incredibly trying times in the Great Depression. I remember the stories of my great-grandmother telling me where she lived on the farm in the Great Depression and how challenging and how hard it was. And so here's a man who was emotionally volatile, not because he's a bad man, not just because he's a mean man, but because he's in incredibly trying circumstances. And so his wife, Helen's mother, began coping by becoming rigid and perfectionistic. So Helen, the daughter, learned early on that staying quiet, avoiding risk, pleasing authority figures is what would keep her safe. So she developed a strong internal core belief: the world is dangerous unless you stay in control. So when Helen grew up and became a mother, Helen passed this anxiety to her daughter, Karen through overprotection and frequent warnings. Don't talk to strangers. Always double check everything. Be careful. You don't know what could happen. Karen internalized the idea that making a mistake was risky and that vigilance was a form of love. Now an adult with 2 kids of her own, Karen finds herself frequently overwhelmed. She worries constantly about school shootings, illness, social media, the future. Without realizing it, she communicates a story of anxiety to her daughter, Mia, by hovering, catastrophizing, and interrupting Mia's attempts to make age-appropriate risk. So then Mia becomes timid, conflict avoidant, prone to stomach aches, and obsessive behaviors when routines change. Each woman carried forward emotional patterns shaped by the last, often unconsciously. The original anxiety rooted in grandmother Helen's childhood survival has now subtly shaped 3 generations. Here's another one. Grandfather, Jack, was a World War II veteran who came home with unspoken trauma. In his generation, expressing fear or vulnerability was considered weakness. He coped by burying his emotions and focusing on work and duty. His motto was push through, don't complain, be a man. And real men don't cry. Now you can see there can be a lot of really healthy qualities of knowing how to push through difficult situations, right? There can be a lot of healthy qualities that come from learning not to complain and grumble in every situation. There can be a lot of good things, but also there can be a lot of unspoken messages that shape us in harmful ways. So he raised his son, David, to do the same. And when David cried as a child, Jack would say, toughen up. There's nothing to be afraid of. And Jack wasn't being cruel. He loved his son, but he believed that shielding David from emotional expression would make him strong. So David grew into a quiet but dependable man. He provided for his family, but he was emotionally distant. His own internal anxiety, especially around failure, emotional messiness, and vulnerability, was never named. It was only managed through control, stoicism, and sometimes angry outbursts when he felt things were outside of his control. So David's son, Ethan, now a teenager, senses that emotion is something to be feared and hidden. So when Ethan feels anxious about school or peer pressure, he isolates, tells no one. He distracts himself with video games. When he's overwhelmed, he shuts down or he lashes out in frustration, just as his father sometimes does. Because children often mirror what their parents model, right? So Ethan's life is very different from his grandfather's, but the emotional message remains. Don't show fear, don't talk about what's inside. The anxiety was passed down not through words, but through modeled silence, emotional avoidance, and a very narrow definition of what it means to be masculine. And so this is just an example of how this works in our current generations, how stories shape what we see and how we show up, because stories shape how we believe and how we behave and shape our sense of belonging. And in Psalm 78, we see an older generation that wants to hand down a different story to the younger generation. A story of hope and truth so that they can be children who trust God and trust his guidance. And I want to leave you with just one familiar story. Remember, we're talking about the story of the house of Ephraim and the house of David. The house of Ephraim did not remember God's goodness and fell away, but the scriptures say the house of David, they did, and they were held by God's grace. How did that story begin? And one little example is, of course, in the very familiar story of David and Goliath. If you remember, David was the youngest of his brothers, and his older brothers had gone off to battle. David was not old enough to go off the battle. David's role was to tend the sheep. He was the shepherd boy in the fields. But you'll remember that the Philistines had this mercenary Goliath, who towered above everyone else. And the scriptures say Goliath would come, and for 40 days and 40 nights, he hurled insults at them, and he told a story of fear and a story of anxiety, a story of lack and scarcity, and a story of abandonment. He scoffed at them and said, "Who are you? I defy you." And he called them the armies of Saul. And this story shaped how they saw him and shaped what they believed about themselves and shaped how they behaved, which they behaved in avoidance and fear, withdrawn. Now, David, we know he did not sit under this story for 40 days and 40 nights. David was in the field, tending the flock. David was in the field saying things like, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because your rod and your staff will comfort me. You will set before me a table in the presence of my enemies. And surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life." David was telling and living a very, very different story, one that shaped his belief and his identity. And so David's father sent him to go take, the scripture says, meat and cheese to his brothers. I just think that's a funny little detail. Go take your brothers a charcuterie tray. They're out on the front lines. And so David shows up, and the older brother looks at him and scoffs him and says, what are you here for? You're just here to get attention for yourself. So you get a little picture of the dynamic and the story between these brothers. David looks at the Philistine and he sees something very different. And he says, "Who is this Philistine that defies not the armies of Saul, but he said the armies of the living God?" He was living in a deeper understanding of identity. And then he remembered the parts of his story. He said, "You know what? I remember God delivered me from the lion. God delivered me from the bear. And today God will deliver me from this threat." And because he lived a different story, he saw a very different thing. And he believed a very different thing. And that shaped the way he showed up. And it shaped the stories that he would tell the generations that followed him. And so God would look at that and say, you are telling the stories of power and provision and goodness and grace, and you followed the guidance of God, and that is a house that will be held with grace. And you and I have been shaped by our stories, for better or for worse. They shape how we see and how we believe. And throughout this series, we want to wrestle with that. We want to become students of our stories. We want to know why we believe what we believe, why we do what we do when we do it. How is that fueled by the internal motivations that, for better or for worse, may have been handed down through the stories that came from those who went before us? And of course, we want God to intervene into that and redeem those broken parts so that we can live in wholeness. So as we said earlier, once a month, we receive communion together as a whole. And so I want to invite you to take out the elements. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he gathered with his disciples around the table and he told a story. And like all good stories have symbols. And he pulled out two very common elements that would have been a part of every first century meal: bread and wine. And these he held up as symbols, and he said, "This bread is a symbol of my body, which will be broken for you, to represent a new covenant." And then he said, "This wine is a symbol of my blood that will be poured out for you for the forgiveness of your sins," a representation of a new covenant. And just like in Psalm 78, where they are warned and they are encouraged to remember the stories of God, Jesus used the same words to his disciple. He said, "When you gather together, do this in remembrance of me." And that as the future generations gather around this story, a story of grace, a story of mystery, a story of love, of power, do this, tell this story to remember who you are and to remember who I am. So I want to invite you now to take the bread and break the bread, the symbol of, and take the bread. And invite you now to take the juice, the symbol of his wine, and receive it. These are symbols in a great story, the story of grace and love and hope and truth.